Hey, it's Rick. Welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be showing you how I paint and model this prop knife. The first step is modeling the base. I created most of this in Modo, but then I tweaked it in ZBrush and did a lot of booleans and other operations. The knife itself went through quite a few different versions. The blade is supposed to be chipped stone, like a slate or something. So I did a lot of booleans for this, creating spheres to take all those chips out. The middle part is some sort of a fabric with some teeth there for the hilt, and then the actual skeleton top is supposed to be carved out of bone. I printed 6 of these at the same time, so I'm going to be working on all of them at once. It just makes the whole process more efficient. The first step is to pick off any little bits of support, and then take a culinary torch and flame off any little wispy bits and stringy bits. And then I'm just using a nail file here to clean up any edges. The next step is to prime the plastic. Here I'm using a 2-part primer. It's like an automotive grade primer. I figure that's got the best shot of actually sticking to the plastic. So it's 2 parts of primer and 1 part of hardener. Now this is the kind of thing you definitely want to wear a respirator for. Not just a dust mask, but an actual organic vapor NIOSH approved respirator. This stuff is pretty toxic. I've got all my top coat colors pre-mixed. I put them into these Gatorade bottles because it just makes it easier. They're already thinned for spraying. Once all the spraying is done on the bases, I'll apply the water slide decals that I've made. You can make your own water slide decals if you've got a laser printer. They sell the materials for it. If you take a piece of regular paper and use some repositionable adhesive to stick that down to the base, this is just a test base that I printed as a prototype, then you can trace out the shape that you want to make, cut it out so that you've got an exact pattern, and then stick that down onto a contrasting color board. Then you can scan that. And once you've got that in the computer, you can just build over top of that with Photoshop or an editor of your choice. And that way you've got the size, the shape, and everything ready to be printed so you know they're going to fit perfectly in the same spots. The only downside, of course, is that you can't print white on a home printer, so your decals are always going to be darker than the base material under them. Here I'm assembling the light pods. I've already done the assembly on the light pods, sorry. What I'm doing now is just inserting them in through the holes, getting the wiring ready so that I can assemble all the electronic parts. As I said, I printed 6 at the same time, so here they are, just stuck into a block of foam that you use for dried flowers. I made these with a little hole in the back. That's how they're going to be mounted to the bases. So I put the pins in here. Now I'm just coating everything with my 2-part primer. The pins are 2mm spring steel, essentially music wire, piano wire they call it. You can buy it at any hobby store. I built this fixture out of 2x4s to hold all the blades while they're drying. The first step for the blades is to give them a coat of black acrylic base. I've also applied some red spotting putty, automotive spotting putty, the kind you use for pinholes and stuff, around the seams where the blade meets the handle. They're printed in 2 separate pieces. I've decided to work from the top down here, so I'm giving the skeleton a little bit of an ivory paint job first, and then I'm coming in with the airbrush with a little bit of yellow ochre just to hit those cracks and crevices. Now a lot of people use oil paints for this to smear on and then rub off, and it collects in the cracks and crevices. It looks great. The problem is it takes forever to dry, especially where it goes in thick. It'll be like weeks. You won't be able to put another coat over top of it or anything else. So what I'm actually using here is acrylic, heavy, thick acrylic, with a retarding agent put into it, which slows the drying time enough that when you rub it on, wash it on and rub it off, that it doesn't dry in between and give you any sort of weird patterns or striations or anything. I'm adding a little bit more darks here with the airbrush, just getting some blacks into the cracks and crevices, all the recessed spots. Now what I'm going to do is add a little bit of stipple texture to the bone. So this is a special stipple nib that's available for an Aztec airbrush. It creates a very uniform stipple pattern. Here I'm just using a little bit of enamel panel wash, the kind of thing you'd use on plastic model kits, just to darken in all the recessed areas. I'm going in here with a paintbrush with a little bit of very thin yellow ochre, just around certain spots on the edges and stuff to give it a little bit of a warm tone. And then I'm doing the opposite here. I've got a very thin blue wash that I'm just washing in all the shadow areas and stuff with. A little bit of dry brushing here over the whole thing just to bring out those chiseled textures I've got in the original model. I'm starting here on the fabric middle of the knife, just giving that a coat of brown paint to begin with. Regular acrylic. I've got this weird rubber paintbrush that I've used for different textural things, and what I'm doing here is applying matte medium. It's an acrylic matte medium with fibers mixed into it. So it's leaving this almost like fibrous texture when it dries on top of the fabric. Should make it look like it's shredded or really old. Here I'm going to use this funky stencil thing that I've got. It's just an airbrush stencil I bought somewhere years ago. I don't think I've ever really used it until now. And just spray in some lighter patterns on that fabric. Now I'm clear coating the whole thing with a matte acrylic varnish. Here I'm using that rubber brush to add more light textures. It's just a tint of the original brown that I used as the base coat. So just mix in a little bit of white, make it lighter. Now I'm starting on the teeth that I've used on the hilt here. This design has gone through a bunch of different versions. Originally, those were actually going to be sharpened pieces of wood, but I didn't like how they looked. Then I made a model version where they were like twigs and they're all bent in different directions. I didn't really like that either, so I settled on using, well, sculpting something that looks like animal teeth. I'm using the same technique here that I used on the skeleton part of the knife, just painting it with acrylic and retarding medium, and then rubbing most of it off with a rag or an old t-shirt. I've started working on the blade here. I'm giving it a base coat of gray, and then I'm going in with my rubber texturing brush to just put some different tones of that on there, some lighter and darker versions. Then I actually make a blue version of the base coat and a warm version of the base coat, and I give it a little bit of a stippling pattern through the middle. I want it to look like maybe there's a seam of iron or some sort of exotic minerals or something running through this rock that they selected to chisel the blade out of. Then I do some dark washes over top. I'm doing the same trick here with the acrylic and the retarding medium, painting it into the crevices all over and then rubbing everything off of the top surface to leave stuff behind. Sort of like a very thick wash. Then I dry brush a lighter tone over all the raised areas just to pick up all the highlights. And here's what the final knife looks like when it's all done, and it's got a couple of coats of clear acrylic varnish over it. Now I'm finishing off the bases. Here's the stems that actually attach the bases to the knives. I'm giving them a base coat of gray, and then putting a little bit of that acrylic or panel wash into the details on the base, just picking up some of that shadows and, gungy areas. All of these need to be weathered and textured and stuff. So here I'm going to clean up some of the extra. That panel line stuff will bleed on acrylic. It will draw itself up into places that you don't really want, so I'm just cleaning that off the top here with a Q-tip and some solvents. I'm going to pick up some more details here with that panel wash in around the light pods and in around all the recessed areas and cracks and crevices and stuff. Then I switch to a natural sponge with a little bit of paint onto it to simulate some chipping effects around this. I imagine that the base of this would actually be originally black underneath, and then it's got a gray paint job on top of it. Kind of like automotive car bumpers. They typically are black injection molded plastic, and then they're painted with whatever they are. Here I'm using some weathering powders to just create some smears underneath what would be the vents. And now I'm test fitting all the stems to make sure everything works. These are a pretty snug fit. The tolerances are pretty close, which is good. You don't really need glue or anything. Here I'm going to give it a little bit of very, very thin down enamel on a rag, and I'm just sort of dabbing all over the place to give it an irregular finish. Now I'm clear coating with acrylic. I believe it's a matte acrylic varnish that I use on this. I don't want these to be shiny. It's good to give them a couple of coats, let it dry between coats, just to make sure that the decals and the weathering powders and the chipping effects and everything else don't come off when it's handled. I've got a little bit more work to do here on the inside, wiring in the battery and the LED lights and the switch and the power plug. This is the base I've decided to go with. I tried to make a battery compartment door, but it didn't really work out for me. No matter what I did, I couldn't really get it to print well on an FDM printer and be flexible enough to get open, yet not be breakable. So in the end, I decided just to make the compartment small enough that the battery would wedge in. That way, once you stick it in there, it's not going to fall out. You don't really need that door. I wanted to make a nameplate out of metal for this, but unfortunately I don't have a laser, so I can't really cut that stuff. I'm using shears, or anything else is going to give you like a nasty edge on that. So I decided to go with a piece of styrene. It's easy to cut, it breaks clean, and then it can be glued in with here I'm using a rubberized crazy glue. But I attached the water slide decal to it first before I did that stuff. And now a few glamour shots under a few different lighting conditions. Here's the actual whole unit by itself without the lights under just a neutral light. Here you can see the lights actually articulated. You can bend them and pose them. I did that because once you put the blade on and take it off again, it might not go back in the same spot, and it's important to be able to put the lights in just the right position. Now, if you'd like one of these knives for yourself, you can see the link in the description. And as always, if you feel like you've learned something here or you've enjoyed this video, please click like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.